do with these workshops. They are intended to be conducted in a more relaxed atmosphere. We've just finished a devotional. We've sang a song to remind us about how that we need to make a decision to follow Jesus, and we need to do that the rest of our lives. Once we make that decision, we need to carry through with that and be faithful to that Jesus that we've decided to follow for our entire lives. We've also spent some time in prayer. Please consider that the conclusion of our devotional, and now we want to spend a little bit of time in a relaxed atmosphere where you feel free to make any comment or observation that you'd like to make, and we want you to feel free to engage yourself, not just mentally. At the minimum, we want that, but we also want you to feel free to participate in any other way that you feel compelled to, given the fact that, remember what we said yesterday, nobody knows everything about anything. All of us have things to learn. You've had some experiences I've not had. You may have read some things and know some things I don't know. And maybe I know some that you don't. Together, I'm hoping that we can think out loud together and be blessed as a result of our thinking out loud together, but making sure that we use the Bible as our guide as we think out loud together about this subject of loss. Now, some of you have experienced loss in your life. Not just loss, but big loss. You know, there are different degrees of loss. Some losses are more important and more impactful than other losses. Some people lose their marriage by divorce. That's a loss. Some people lose their health and they get a terrible neurological diagnosis. Maybe they're told, like my wife was in her early 50s, that you have Parkinson's disease. Well, that's a loss. And then we have to learn to live with that loss the rest of our life. We can't change the fact that we've been divorced either. No matter whether we choose to live by ourselves the rest of our lives or marry again, we still have experienced that loss. That loss of something really precious, and what was lost was a marriage relationship. Sometimes we lose things that are of a spiritual nature. You know, we lose our children to the world, to the devil. And it's heartbreaking. After pouring all the time and effort we do in our heart into our children's lives, sometimes they do not choose to embrace faith, but instead they choose the world. And that's a loss. It is a heartbreaking loss. When we human beings suffer loss, we have something that we use to describe the impact, and it's called the word grief. Now, I recently read on Facebook from somebody who posted about grief, and they made the remark that grief was emotional, and gave the impression that it was merely emotional. And actually, that's not true. Have you ever thought about the fact that your brain grieves? Frankly, I'd never thought about this until I'd written a manuscript for my third book called After the End Comes. And I sent the manuscript to a lady in Southern California named Cindy Bostic. And I asked her for feedback because she was a widow. When she sent me back some comments about the manuscript, she said, "Hey, I ran across this book that you might want to read before you finish this manuscript to be printed." And what she recommended to me was a book called The Grieving Brain. The Grieving Brain. Not the grieving heart, the grieving brain. The lady who wrote this book is a neuroscientist. And she spent decades in her life as a neuroscientist studying the brain, and especially the impact of grief, loss, on the brain of us human beings. Now, in addition to that, she also is a psychologist. So she has the benefit and the blessing of having the psychological background academically, and the blessing of having the scientific background. And she has spent a great deal of her life studying the brain from the standpoint of the impact that loss has on the brain. I want to read to you a section of her book. Even when a person has been ill for a long time, no one knows what it will be like to walk through the world without that other person. My contribution as a scientist has been to study grief from the brain's perspective. From the perspective that the brain is trying to solve a problem when faced with the absence of a very important person in our life. Grief is a heart-wrenchingly painful problem for the brain to solve. And grieving necessitates learning to live in the world with the absence of someone that you love deeply, who is ingrained in your understanding of the world. This means that for the brain, your loved one is simultaneously gone and also everlasting. And you are walking through two worlds at the same time. You are navigating your life despite the fact that they have been stolen from you. A premise that makes no sense and is both confusing and upsetting to your brain. I've had a number of people say to me after they had lost a precious person in their life, and especially have I heard widowed people say this, where their loss was their spouse. I thought I was going crazy. You have so many things that go on inside of us. Things that are bouncing around between our ears. And then we have this feeler that contributes to the confusion that we're experiencing. And we are inside trying to solve a problem that is extremely hard to solve. She made the remark that it's actually that when we've lost somebody, they are simultaneously alive because they're alive in the neurons of your brain. Your brain has neurons. And in your brain, that person is alive. It takes a long time for your brain to respond to the reality of the absence of that person. And then yet at the same time, they're gone. We don't see them anymore. We don't hug them anymore. We don't touch them anymore. We cannot smell them anymore. We don't interact with them in our life. And so we find ourselves very confused because we've lost somebody of great value in our life. I think somebody who's written about it pretty bluntly is the lady who wrote this book, The Widow's Mite. She wrote this book after she lost her husband. And let me read to you a section of what she writes about her experience after the loss of her husband. She said, "When Dale was alive, I felt the magnitude of our relationship every day. Even when he was traveling. Some days it was so intense it was overpowering. Now the space inside of me, previously occupied by that passionate relationship, was strangely empty. I went from having someone think I was the most amazing person on earth to feeling invisible and vacant. We have to be careful when we're empty inside. If we're not, we can make awful choices regarding what to pour into the void. Drugs, alcohol, sex, people who don't have our best interests in mind." Ken Knight talks about that confusing time that we struggle with after we've lost somebody really precious in our life. It can be so bad when we've lost somebody so precious in our life that we can become desperate, we can become a person in despair, and we can lose our hope. Now, we're going to talk about tonight, Lord willing, tomorrow night and Wednesday night, about finding hope in loss. Hope is of great value. Stop and think about how valuable it is in our life and how it will motivate us to do certain things. For instance, now think out loud with me here for a moment. Why does a person invest in the stock market?
They hope to make some money on that.
Okay, do they always make money on that? Boy, especially not recently. But their hope, that's what motivates them. Their hope is they're going to make money, and that's why we participate in a stock market. Well, now, stop and think about people who get hitched, people who get married. Okay, we've got two people up here, and they both say, I do. Why do people get married? What are they hoping for?
Companionship.
They're wanting happiness. The kind of happiness that's very special, that is restricted to that very unique relationship of a husband and a wife. People don't get married in hopes of getting divorced or in hope of having misery. People get married in the hope that they can enjoy a very special and unique kind of love in their life. Why do people change jobs? What are they hoping for when people change jobs? What are they hoping for?
Something better.
Something better. See, they're making a decision based on their hope. Hope has a way of motivating us to behave in a certain way. Well, if we're experiencing some things in our life that really rock us, and we begin to feel hopeless, how are we going to conduct ourselves in our life? How motivated is a person going to be if they're in the grip of hopelessness? Now, I want you to stop and think out loud with me for a few minutes here. I want you to think about things that might cause a person to find themselves feeling hopeless. What kind of life experiences will cause a person to feel hopeless? Now, obviously, I'm going to start out with the easy one. My ministry is called Widowhood Workshop. It doesn't strictly deal with people who are struggling with the life after the loss of their spouse. We deal with grief generally, and we highlight especially the struggle of dealing with life after the loss of our spouse. But obviously, when a person loses something so precious as a spouse that they have loved dearly and appreciated so much in their life, they may be feeling and may be thinking in such a way as if they can find themselves in the grip of hopelessness. How motivated are they going to be to get up out of bed? How motivated are they to take care of things around the house? How motivated are they going to be to make a meal for themselves and to feed themselves well? See, hope motivates and inspires us. Hopelessness can cause us to live a very ineffective and a very sad life. Now, give me another life circumstance that would cause somebody to struggle with hopelessness.
Losing your job.
What if you lost your job? And what if that job was a part of your identity? And that happens sometimes. Sometimes we do something for so long that it becomes not just a part of us, but it becomes our identity. If I were to quit preaching, would I still be a preacher? I mean, preachers preach. But, you know, there comes a time sometimes when you do need to bow off the stage. There are things sometimes that are challenging that will cause us to maybe realize we need to retire. We need to back away for one reason or the other. Or somebody comes in and forces you to change your job because you get retired or you get fired. And if a great deal of your identity, your personal perspective about yourself was associated with that job, you're going to struggle with hopelessness. Especially if you're older in age. Who's going to hire you? I don't know how many guys I know who have lost their job later in life, then went job hunting, and they kept hearing the same thing. Well, you're just overqualified. You're just overqualified. Imagine struggling with that dilemma in your life. Give me another life circumstance that would cause somebody to struggle with hopelessness.
Health.
Yeah, what if you were to lose your health? And here, you thought you were healthy, and then you find out that you're not. And it is not something that can be cured easily. And maybe there are treatments that you have to experience. Maybe there are surgeries that you have to experience. Maybe there are medications that you have to take. And your life and your function for the rest of your life is going to be affected because now you're not healthy anymore. And you become severely limited. Well, if you were active and healthy prior to that, it's very likely you're going to struggle with fighting off a sense of hopelessness in your life. See, this isn't just about the loss of people in our lives. It can be the loss of a lot of different things that can cause us to feel very hopeless. And that has an impact on us. It causes us to become inactive and actually feel as if we're of no value. If you feel as if you're no value and you become inactive, then you're not any longer living a life that brings glory and honor to God. God did not create us to merely exist. He created us to live to the praise of His glory. And we're not going to do that if we permit ourselves to be engulfed and begin drowning in a sense of hopelessness. But there are life circumstances that we can experience, especially life losses, that are like hope stealers. They steal our hope from us. Now, not that they should be permitted to. I'm not suggesting that. But I'm suggesting that sometimes circumstances, if we permit them, can steal our hope. And when we're feeling hopeless, we're going to be of no value to God. Hopelessness is not a set of circumstances. Hopelessness is a feeling. James Dobson has written many, many good books. A lot of them are about marriage and about family. He wrote a book for people ages 16 to 26 that's called Life on the Edge. And that book is written because he describes that decade between age 16 and age 26 as a critical decade of life. And he points out the fact that during 16 to 26, we make some decisions that many of which can affect us the rest of our life. They set the stage for the rest of our life. Whether or not we live a life of value, productivity, a life of faithfulness to the Lord, a life of respect and dignity, a lot of that goes back to decisions we make where we lay that foundation between age 16 and 26. Well, in this book, one chapter deals with emotions. And he's trying to communicate to people between 16 and 26, be real careful about permitting yourself to be guided by your emotions. And it's in that context he makes this observation. Emotions are biased, whimsical, unreliable. They lie as often as they tell the truth. We must understand that emotions are unreliable and at times tyrannical. If we permit ourselves to be in the grips of hopelessness, no matter what the circumstances are, if we permit that to happen, we're in great jeopardy. When emotions are behind the wheel of the car of our life, we're in great danger. God created us with a thinker and a feeler. And both the thinker and the feeler have a purpose. And the thinker is the one that's supposed to be guiding us as we go through life and make very important decisions in our life. Hopelessness is a feeling. Hopelessness is not a set of circumstances. It is a feeling. It's our reaction, our personal emotional reaction to a set of circumstances or something that we're experiencing in our life. But it can cause us to feel as if we are just drowning in our negative circumstances. Boy, that really creates some things to consider in regard to the Bible. Because hope is something that's talked about in the Bible. Now, I'm going to ask whoever has this passage in the book of Job to read aloud Job chapter 1 and also Job chapter 1 verse 1 and then verse 8. Who has that passage?
I do.
Okay, read it good and loud, please.
You want just verse 1 and
Just verse 1 and verse 8.
There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. And then in verse 8, then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil.
Okay, how would you paraphrase the kind of man Job was? It's really important, I think, that we nail this down before we look at chapter 7, verse 6. What kind of man was Job? He was upright.
God-fearing.
He was a God-fearing man. Trustworthy. Was he evil?
No.
Did he frequently choose to do evil? He hated sin. He shunned the evil. He was devoted to God. What I'm trying to point out is this is a great man of God. Now, we all know that Job suffered greatly. As a matter of fact, he suffered so greatly that he said some things that were way out of line. Take, for instance, Job 7, verse 6. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle. Now, there's no question about that. Life is fast. You can go from day 1 to 60 really quick. That's in my rearview mirror. I know about that. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle. Now watch that last phrase. And are spent without hope. What Job experienced, his losses, his circumstances, caused him to say that he had no hope. Was Job without hope? Well, why did he say it? If he wasn't without hope, why did he say it? He was a good, righteous, devoted to God kind of man. Why did he say that?
He was grieving.
He was grieving. When you've got a grieving brain and a grieving feeler, you're going to say and think things that are not consistent with reality. Job was not without hope. Now, there are some people who are without hope. Somebody has the book of Ephesians. Who has the book of Ephesians, chapter 2, starting with verse 11? Okay, Miss Betty?
Wherefore remember that ye being in times past Gentiles in the flesh, who are called by uncircumcision by that which is called the circumcision in the flesh made by hands, that at that time you were without Christ, being absent, aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope, and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, ye who sometimes were far off are made nigh by the blood of Christ.
Are there people without hope? What does the Bible say? In Ephesians 2, are there people without hope? Now, why are they without hope? What are they without? They are without the Lord. They are without God and without hope in the world. Now, what about Job? Was Job without hope? Did he have God in his life? Yes, he had God in his life. He believed in God. He never turned his back on God, but he did say some things that I just kind of suspicion brought a tear to the cheek of God. Imagine God loving him, providentially watching over him and caring for him, making certain that there was nothing that he experienced that Job couldn't handle without him. And then Job would say he was without hope. Have you ever thought about the impact that Job's statement must have had on God? There's a difference between a Christian and somebody who's not a Christian. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, there is a comforting passage written to people who were very concerned about their loved ones who had passed on, missing out on the second coming of the Lord. And what Paul does is he explains to them, I don't want you to be ignorant. You're my brethren, he says, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope. So there are people who have no hope. The people who literally have no hope are the people without God. But Christians are not without hope, because we who are Christians have a Father in heaven. And as long as we have a Father in God, we have hope in this life. No matter what our circumstances are, no matter how hurt that we might be by our circumstances, no matter how confused or how desperate that we may be feeling, if we have God, we are not without hope. And as a matter of fact, somebody has the passage in verse 18 of that chapter. Who has that? Johnny, go ahead.
All right. Therefore, comfort one another with these words.
Comfort one another with these words. What were they words about? They were words about hope. Tomorrow we're going to spend some time focusing in on how frequently that word is used in the New Testament. It's very frequently. But one of the things that I just want to really hone in on tonight is to help us to understand that no matter how hurt we might be, or how scared we might be, how troubled we are by our circumstances or what we've experienced in our life, no matter how much pain we may be feeling, whether it's emotional and mental pain or even physical pain, if we're Christians, our Father is in heaven, and we always have hope. There's never a time when we as Christians are without hope. But we've got to keep in mind we're human beings. Job was a superior human being. And yet, he felt, because of his circumstances, he felt things were hopeless. See, sometimes when we're struggling with negative circumstances, we have a tendency to become pretty extreme in how we think and how we feel. I'll give you another example of Job in Job chapter 14, when he makes this observation in his life. He says in Job 14 verse 1, I'm sure you're familiar with this passage. Man who is born of woman is a few days and full of trouble. Now, if man's life is full of trouble, what does that say about blessings? If the trash can is full, how much more trash can you put in it? None. But you see, he was experiencing so many heartaches, and he had lost so much in his life, and he was so dramatically impacted that he wasn't thinking straight, he wasn't talking straight, and he became very exaggerated in his feelings, in his thoughts, and some of the things that he said. His life was not full of trouble. As a matter of fact, I want you to think about the blessings Job had at the worst time in his life. Now, he said, man that's born of woman is a few days and full of trouble. So was his life full of trouble? Well, he may have felt that way, but I want you to name me blessings he still had when he was at his worst. Can you name one?
He still had God.
Okay, he still had God. If he had nothing else than God, would that mean his life was full of trouble, that he had no blessings? If you have God, you have the greatest blessing. But you see, even him, as a devoted man of God, he just couldn't wrap his brain around that concept. One of the things that we need to understand is how patient we need to be with ourselves. Whenever we are struggling with something extremely difficult, we've got to understand that we're not machines. We're human beings. We have a thinker and a feeler. And our thinker doesn't know everything. And our feeler can be biased, can become tyrannical. And we can think and feel things that can cause us to just not see things clearly in our life anymore. Things that we had firmly planted in our mind, when we're shaken by some of the circumstances of life, we can get to the point where we start questioning and we start doubting. And it's okay to be human. Remember what Jesus said, the spirit is willing, but what's the other problem? Yeah, the spirit may be willing, but the flesh is weak. We need to appreciate the fact that we have our weaknesses. And when we're working with people who are going through traumatic times in their life, we need to be patient with them. We need to understand that they're going through a very difficult time that we can't fully understand. Don't ever say to somebody, I know how you feel, because you can't. You're not living in their skin. You haven't been through the exact circumstances that they have been through. We need to be patient with ourselves and patient with others, just like God is patient with us and He's long-suffering with all of us. We need to realize that we need to be that way when we're struggling with a difficult time. And the struggle isn't necessarily a bad thing. For those of you who were here yesterday, a quick reminder for those of you who weren't. What we studied yesterday was turning your blessings or your burdens into blessings, and how that we can actually do that. We can actually take the burdens that we've experienced and we can find ourselves blessed because we've experienced burdens. James chapter 1 verses 2 through 4 talks about us experiencing those troubles and those trials, and yet as a result of that, finding ourselves developing more endurance, more steadfastness, more patience, one translation says. The burdens that we bear, that we struggle with, can cause us to exercise our faith and get to a point where we're stronger than we ever were before. We understand this in regard to a lot of things physically with our muscles. If you don't use your muscles, what happens to them?
You lose them.
Yeah, you use it or you lose it. The same thing is true with us spiritually. If we're not challenged, and if we don't struggle, and we don't have to work hard to develop ourselves and keep faithful to the Lord and deal with our circumstances, then we're going to become weakened people. I'm not suggesting that we pray to God and ask Him to burden us more. I mean, who wants any more than we already have? But what I am suggesting is, with every burden that we bear, we can commit ourselves to becoming the better, stronger, more patient, more enduring child of God than we ever have been before. But the alternative is permitting ourselves to drown in our hopelessness. And if there's ever something that can prompt us to embrace hopelessness, it's when we lose a beloved spouse in our life. The studies that I've seen that rate the stressors, the 100 stressors of human life, the results are always the same. The number one stressor is loss of spouse. Do you know what the second one is? It's divorce. The loss of a spouse by death and then divorce are the two greatest stressors that we human beings could struggle with in this life. And just because we're Christians doesn't give us a get out of struggle card free. We're going to have to work with ourselves and with our circumstances. Well, one of the things that becomes critically important is fighting that feeling of hopelessness. Not permitting that hopelessness that we're tempted to feel become the dominant thing that drives us in our life. And the way that you do that is by exercising self-control. There is a brother named Paul Faulkner who's gone on to his reward, who was a very well-known counselor and also professor at a Christian university. And he wrote a book called Making Things Right When Things Go Wrong. And in that book, one of the things that he points out is that if we're going to get over our negative feelings, that there's really only one way to do that effectively. He says there's times when we simply need to act better than we feel. We just have to permit our thinker to cause us to go ahead and act better than we feel. I wonder how many people who are members of the church would be willing to admit the fact that on Sunday mornings there have been times when they didn't want to come to church. But then you get yourself up out of bed and you go to the public assembly where God is being praised, and then you find yourself being lifted up. You find yourself being boosted. Your morale is boosted. Your spirit is lifted. You've chosen to act better than you feel. That's self-control. Self-control isn't just restraining yourself, it's also motivating yourself. Self-control has to do with restraint, and then also has to do with motivation. And that self-control is a very important part of being a Christian. Bringing every thought, Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. Every thought. And sometimes, because of our circumstances, we are prompted to think that this situation is hopeless. We can't let that grip us. We may experience it for a while, but we can't let that feeling get a grip on us. I remember old-time preachers. They were probably about my age when I was younger. And I used to think of them as old-time preachers, and they would talk about how that you can't stop the birds from flying over your head, but you can stop them from roosting on it. Well, that's true when it comes to thoughts and feelings that we shouldn't be having, and we shouldn't be permitting to drive us and cause us to act and feel certain ways. But this is definitely a challenging issue in life. Both the fruit of the Spirit and the Christian graces include in their descriptions self-control. Sometimes we spend more time trying to control other people's lives than controlling our own lives. That self-control is a part of us maturing as a child of God and learning to overcome the feelings that tempt us to become dead weight, tempt us to become inactive, tempt us to become extremely negative in our thinking. And here's the key: needing to remind ourselves that we have a God who's described in a unique way. And when we have Him, we have a key to living a life of value. Now may the God of hope, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, that you may abound in hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. God, a God of hope, that gives us the ability to live abounding in hope, and that is not contingent on positive life circumstances. See, we can have negative, difficult, stressful life circumstances and still have hope. But one of the things that we need to keep in mind is the hope that we have as Christians is not just about our desires and our wishes. The hope we have as Christians is of a spiritual nature, and it has to do with the things that are eternal. And see, the things here in this world do not have the ability, unless we give them that ability. The circumstances that we experience in this world do not have the ability to steal a hope that is founded in our relationship with God. As long as we have God, we have hope. And that hope has to do with the things spiritual and the things eternal. Our circumstances in this world may not change for the better. We're not guaranteed that they will. They can, but they also may not. But if we dealt with a negative life circumstance for the rest of our life, when we draw that last breath, our hope is realized. Our precious, most valuable hope is realized because we have a God who's a God of hope. Another passage and section of passages is in the book of Colossians. A number of references to our hope. The hope which is laid up for you in heaven. See, that's a spiritual, eternal hope. Chapter 1, verse 5. Chapter 1, verse 23. He encourages us not to be moved away from the hope of the gospel. If we've obeyed the gospel, and if we're living consistent with the gospel, then we can always have hope no matter what our life circumstances are. If we have Christ, what do we have? Christ in us is the hope of glory. See, the hope is not about life circumstances. The hope that cannot be touched by negative life circumstances is our hope that is residing in our relationship with God. Christians always have hope. There is never, ever an exception to that. If we are Christians, if we're followers of Jesus, we have a Father in heaven who loves us. A Father in heaven who will provide for us every step of the way. Now that doesn't mean we're not going to struggle emotionally or mentally or psychologically. But despite the negativity of sometimes our feelings, our thoughts, and our circumstances, we always have hope if we're disciples of Jesus, because God is our Father. There's a difference between how our feeler communicates to us and how God communicates with us. God's promise to us is absolute. It's guaranteed by the death of His Son and His resurrection. And it's because of that absolute positivity that we can be absolutely positive about our spiritual life and about our eternal inheritance. No matter what, no matter how ugly our life circumstances might be. There's hope, and that hope is in the Lord. Can you imagine us being able to talk about hope not just one night, but a second night and a third night? We're going to do that. If the Lord permits, tomorrow evening and Wednesday evening as well, we're going to return to this very theme. There is a lot to be said about hope in the Bible. Before we finish, there was a desire for us to offer an invitation. And I think it would certainly be appropriate at this particular juncture to offer an invitation to somebody who might be struggling with a very difficult time in their life. Do you know why sometimes brothers and sisters in the Lord don't receive the help that they really need? It's because we don't know what they're going through. If we choose to lead such a private life that we won't permit others to know that we're struggling, we will never receive the help that we can receive from God's family. The family of God, among other things, is like a divine support group. But we can't be supportive and encouraging to one another if we don't know when and who is struggling in their life. It's okay to let other people know that you're not okay and that you're really struggling with something. And so at this point, what we're going to do is give you an opportunity. We're going to sing an invitation hymn. And when we sing this invitation song, if you'd like to have the prayers of the church, you feel free to come. And feel free to share what you'd like to about whatever struggle that you're having. It could be a marital struggle. It could be a struggle with yourself personally. It could be a mental illness that you're struggling with, which is nothing to be ashamed of. It could be a financial struggle that you're dealing with. It could be a dysfunctional family issue that you're struggling with. Whatever you're struggling with, it's okay to admit the fact that you're struggling. Because the reality is all of us struggle at different phases in our life for different reasons. So if you need the prayers of the church, we want you to feel free to respond. But also if you'd like to become a disciple of Jesus, if you'd like to become a Christian, we'd love to hear your confession of faith. We'll help you be baptized into Jesus Christ with that penitent heart, and you can begin to walk with the Lord and have this hope that cannot be stolen by any negative circumstance in your life. Boy, what encouragement that is. That you can have a hope that cannot be touched by the negative circumstances of your life. If you'd like to have that kind of hope and start with it tonight, you go ahead and respond. Come forward while we stand and while we sing.